The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Daniel pulled his thin coat tighter around his body. It wasn't enough to keep the chill away, but he was used to it. Nights like these were the hardest when the city felt too big, too lonely, and the hunger in his stomach was too strong to ignore. He sat on the hard pavement near a closed cafe, his back resting against the cold brick wall. A small, crumpled paper bag sat beside him, holding the last piece of bread he had. He stared at it for a long moment, then sighed. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he reached for the bread, a soft sound broke the silence, a faint meow. Daniel turned his head and saw a small cat a few feet away. Its fur was dirty, matted in places, and its thin frame spoke of days without food. The cat's green eyes locked onto his, full of silent desperation. Daniel hesitated. He barely had enough for himself. But something about the cat, its quiet suffering, the way it didn't beg, just waited, stirred something deep inside him. With a small, tired smile, he tore a piece of the bread and placed it gently on the ground. The cat didn't move at first, just stared at him as if trying to understand his kindness. Then, cautiously, it stepped forward, sniffed the food, and began to eat. Daniel watched in silence, feeling something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of warmth, of connection. He had nothing, yet he had shared. And as the cat finished eating and looked up at him again, something in its gaze told him this was only the beginning. Daniel exhaled, his breath forming a faint mist in the cold night air. He pulled his coat tighter around himself and glanced down at the cat. It had finished the bread, but instead of running off, it sat there, watching him with its deep green eyes. There was something familiar in that gaze, something that made Daniel's chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. "You're not afraid of me, huh?" he murmured, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The cat blinked slowly, then curled its tail around its small body, as if settling in for the night. Daniel looked away, staring at the city lights in the distance. It had been a long time since someone had looked at him without judgment. People walked past him every day, pretending he didn't exist. But this cat, this tiny, fragile thing, had seen him. A small, tired chuckle escaped his lips. "Guess we're both strays, huh?" He leaned his head back against the brick wall, letting his mind drift. But instead of the usual emptiness, memory surfaced, stone he had buried long ago. A different night, years ago. A warm house, the scent of fresh bread in the air. A soft voice calling his name, his mother's voice. Daniel swallowed hard. He hadn't thought about her in years. Not since he lost everything. The memory was like a sharp knife, cutting through the numbness he had built around himself. He had once belonged somewhere. He had once been loved. His fingers instinctively reached into his pocket, brushing against something rough. His heart clenched as he pulled it out, a small, crumpled photograph. It was old and faded, the edges worn from being carried for too long. In the picture, a young boy sat on the floor, laughing as a cat rubbed against his shoulder. His mother stood behind him, smiling softly. Daniel stared at the image, his throat tightening. The cat in the photo had the same green eyes as the one sitting beside him now. It was impossible. It had to be a coincidence. But as he looked at the tiny creature beside him, something deep inside whispered that this moment, this night, wasn't random. The cat stretched, then walked closer, pressing its small body against his side. A quiet warmth spread through Daniel's chest. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been forgotten after all. Daniel left the library with the photograph clutched tightly in his hand. His mind raced with questions. If his mother had been looking for him, why had they never found each other? Was she still searching? Was she even still alive? The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily on his chest, but the cat trotted beside him as if it had no doubt at all. It moved with quiet confidence, occasionally glancing up at him as if urging him forward. He needed more answers. A memory tugged at the edges of his mind, the faintest recollection of a house, a street name, something his mother had once said. He walked for hours, following instincts he didn't know he had, until he found himself standing in front of an old, worn-down apartment building, his stomach twisted. Something about this place felt familiar. With hesitant steps, he approached the building and entered the dimly lit hallway. The air smelled of dust and forgotten time. He scanned the old mailboxes near the entrance, searching for a name that might spark recognition. Nothing. Just as he was about to turn away, a voice called out, "Daniel?" His heart stopped. An elderly woman stood at the top of the stairs, gripping the railing as if she needed to hold herself up. Her face was thin, her eyes searching. There was something eerily familiar about her, but Daniel couldn't place it. "Do I?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears welled in her eyes. "I knew you when you were just a boy." His throat tightened. "Who are you?" She stepped closer, hands trembling. "I was your mother's neighbor. She lived here. For years. She never stopped looking for you." The words hit Daniel like a tidal wave. His mother had been here. She had searched for him. He swallowed the lump in his throat and forced himself to ask the question he was terrified to hear the answer to. "Where is she now?" The woman's face fell. She looked away, as if trying to find the right words. Finally, she sighed. She passed away last winter." Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. The world tilted. He staggered back, shaking his head. No, that can't be." "I'm so sorry." Her voice was full of sorrow. "She never stopped hoping. She always believed you would come back." Daniel turned away, gripping the wall for support. He had spent so many years believing he had no one left. Now he found out that he had been wrong, but it was too late. She was gone. The cat rubbed against his leg, a small gesture of comfort. The old woman hesitated before speaking again. "There's something you should..." Numbly, Daniel followed her up the stairs. She led him to a small apartment on the second floor. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a quiet, untouched space. Dust floated in the air, and the scent of old books and faded memories clung to the wall. And then he saw it. On the small wooden table near the window, there was a framed photograph, the same photograph he carried in his pocket. Next to it was a small box, carefully placed, as if waiting for someone to open it. With shaky hands, Daniel reached for the box and lifted the lid. Inside, he found letters, dozens of them. Some were addressed to him. Some had never been sent. He picked up the first one, unfolding it with trembling fingers. "My dearest Daniel," it read, "I don't know if this letter will ever reach you, but I want you to know that I love you. I always have. If you ever find your way back to me, I will be waiting." Daniel's vision blurred with tears. He read letter after letter, each one filled with love, with hope, with a mother's unwavering belief that her son would come home. A sob escaped his throat. He had spent years believing he had been abandoned, but the truth was he had always been wanted. The cat jumped onto the table, settling beside the letters. It purred softly, and in that moment, Daniel understood. This wasn't just about finding his past, it was about finding himself. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start again. Daniel sat in the dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the echoes of a past he never knew existed. His mother's letters lay scattered across the table, each word pressing into his heart like a weight too heavy to bear. He had spent years believing he was forgotten, abandoned. But here, in this tiny, dust-filled space, was proof that he had been loved all along. The cat curled up beside him, watching as his fingers trembled over the last letter in the box. He hesitated before opening it, afraid of what final words his mother had left behind. With a deep breath, he unfolded the fragile paper. "My sweet boy, if you ever find this, know that I never gave up. I don't know where life has taken you, but I pray every night that you are safe, that you are loved. If I don't get to see you again, promise me one thing. Don't let the past define you. Keep going, Daniel. Keep moving forward." Tears blurred the ink as he clutched the letter to his chest. A sudden noise outside snapped him from his grief. Footsteps, Chevy. Deliberate, he echoed in the hallway. Daniel turned just as the old woman at the door stiffened. Her face paled. "You need to go," she whispered urgently. Before he could ask why, the door burst open. A man stood in the doorway, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. His face was aged and weathered, but Daniel recognized him instantly. It was his father. A cold rush of fear ran through him. Memories he had buried deep clawed their way back, the shouting, the slammed doors, the night he was taken from his mother's arm. He thought he had escaped that life forever. But now, standing before him, was the man who had once torn his world apart. "What are you doing here?" his father demanded, his voice rough with years of resentment. Daniel clenched his fists. "I could ask you the same thing." The man stepped forward, eyes dark with something unreadable. "She left this place." Daniel's stomach twisted. This was her home, his father scoffed. "She was waiting for a boy who never came back, and now you show up after she's gone? What do you want? Pity?" Daniel's blood boiled. I didn't know she was looking for me because you kept me away." From her. Silence. A tense, suffocating silence. His father looked at him for a long moment before exhaling sharply. "It was for the best." Daniel felt something snap inside him. "The best for who? You stole me from her. You made me believe I had no one." His father's face hardened. "She was weak. She wouldn't have survived raising you on her own." Daniel's breath hitched. Every part of him wanted to lash out, to scream, to make his father feel even an ounce of the pain he had carried for years. But then he heard his mother's words in his head. "Don't let the past define you. Keep moving forward." His hands unclenched, he took a shaky breath and straightened his shoulders. "I'm not here to fight you," he said quietly. "I came to find the truth, and I found it." His father scoffed. "And what now? You think you can change anything?" Daniel looked down at the cat, still sitting calmly beside him. Its golden eyes watched him, unshaken, as if it already knew the answer. "No," Daniel said. "I can't change the past, but I can decide what happens next." He turned, picking up the letters, the photograph, the last remnants of his mother's love. Then, without another word, he walked past his father, out of the apartment and into the night. His heart pounded, his hands shook, but for the first time in his life, he felt free. The cat followed close behind, and as Daniel stepped into the cool air, he finally understood. This wasn't just about finding his mother. This was about finding himself. And he wasn't lost anymore. Daniel walked through the quiet streets, his breath visible in the cold night air. The city lights flickered like distant stars, but he felt neither lost nor alone. The weight he had carried for so long, the anger, the grief, the unanswered questions had begun to lift. His mother's words stayed with him, echoing in his heart. "Keep moving forward." The cat trotted beside him, its small paws barely making a sound. Daniel looked down at it, realizing just how much had changed in such a short time. He had found something he wasn't looking for, a connection, a reminder that love had always been there, even in the spaces he thought were empty. He reached a small park bench and sat down, watching the city hum with life around him. The cat jumped onto his lap, purring softly. He gently ran his fingers through its fur, feeling warmth seep into his chest. "I guess we're both starting over," he murmured. The cat looked up at him, its golden eyes full of quiet understanding. Daniel thought about his mother, not just the loss, but the love she had left behind. Love that had found its way to him. Even now, he would never get to see her again, but he could honor her by living, by choosing kindness, by never letting himself be defined by pain alone. He had spent years believing he had nothing, but now he saw the truth. He had a chance, a future, a new beginning. The cat nuzzled against him, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel smiled. He didn't know exactly where life would take him next, but for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel so heavy. It felt like hope.